So in this segment, we're going to be discussing Brexit has lost us 25% of sales. British bike storage firm buckles under red tape. And this is a great example of a small or medium enterprise, depending on how you want to define it, how you define the two, losing out because of Brexit red tape. And this is pretty sad stuff, I'll be honest. So British cycling entrepreneur says Brexit has buckled his business and left him with a £100,000 hole in revenues, accusing the government of failing to do enough to mitigate its impact on British small exporters. Cyclock, which has made a name for its distinctive indoor bicycle storage and accessories, says the EU represents 50% of its business before Brexit, and it's left it nursing a 25% decline in overall sales. So cycling is very popular in a lot of EU member states. Cities such as Amsterdam and Paris are very cycling positive. I think the mayor of Paris more recently, over the last couple of years, introduced a load of cycle lanes into Paris. Storing a bike is difficult because you leave them outside and it'd probably get robbed depending on the area you live in, where I live. Leaving them inside takes up space where this company has products, not a sponsored video in case you're wondering, but they have lost a quarter of their sales. So effectively what they do allow you to do by the looks of it is wall mount your bikes onto the wall, so then it doesn't take up as much space. So they've lost a quarter of their sales, whilst the EU was 50% of their business. So they have kept some of their EU trade, but for a business to lose that much of its sales can tank a company, especially a small one. The owner says, quote, "It's very disappointing. I'm naturally a naturally optimistic person, but in a sense it's very difficult to be positive," said the company's founder and designer Andrew Lang in his studio in East London. Quote, "One of the things that is quite disappointing about this whole process is that from the outset we made an active decision to manufacture in the UK. We've remained faithful to that, and it feels as though the UK government hasn't necessarily helped us," end quote. And had he set up manufacturing in the EU, or at least partial manufacturing in the EU, he would not have a lot of these problems. Distributors across the EU lapped up the wall mounting blocks, which cost from £43, and hang bikes in any orientation or space, stopping them cluttering the hallways across the continent. By the time Brexit came along, business was flying with 10,000 units sold in the EU each year, an annual turnover hitting £450,000. That's almost a revenue of £500,000. But once the new rules, obviously these aren't new rules, and go through the whole thing of these are existing rules but are implemented onto us because we're a third country. After the transition period, businesses started to slow down, especially after Amazon stopped fulfilling orders for individual customers buying from Britain. So I can imagine that hanging up a bike saves up a lot of space, and the added security is also a pretty cool factor, especially live in a city. If you think of how much a bike costs and the space they can take up, you can save a lot of space. So you can have more than one bike if you're so inclined. This is great for those, darn city slickers who have good cycle roads, which I do not. Amazon probably stopped shipping from the UK, or at least Great Britain, for the paperwork reasons. It's not worth it for small shipments. We've covered this stuff before. You have customs, amongst other things, and I'm not sure exactly how Amazon shipping works, kind of internationally. I'm assuming they pass it off to another distributor, which comes at a cost. There was also a drop in confidence in British products, says the Cyclock head of operations, Claire Lowe, with some, quote, EU distributors stopping placing orders, citing cost of shipping and customs clearance as prohibitive, end quote. And customs clearance is another massive problem. For them to sell directly from the UK, or should I say Great Britain really in this case, there would likely be customs fees, which as the end customer sucks, because you're about to get your parcel, then boom, at the door or the post office, they're asking you for payment, even though you've already paid for the product, but you haven't paid for the customs fees. I can imagine if you're a small business, it can be like that. How are you supposed to, plan out your spending for the year when you can randomly get hit by customs checks? That can be prohibitive to sales. And if the paperwork is not done properly, the product can get sent back, and shipping is already taking longer and costing more. So essentially you're paying double the shipping costs if something gets sent back. These things can damage confidence from consumers and businesses, and if there are anyone in the EU making similar products, which let's be honest, they probably are, or they will be, you're more likely to buy from them. The company made every effort to beat what Lang calls Kafka-esque Brexit red tape. Sorry if you can hear my cat, he's very animated about this. By opening up a warehouse in the Netherlands at the end of 2021 to ensure costly paperwork would only have to be done per truckload from Dover rather than per individual unit. So this makes sense. The Netherlands has great shipping routes and the products are probably popular over there. So if they ship from GB to their warehouse in the Netherlands, it means they have to pay one lot of customs and other relevant paperwork. So when they sell from the warehouse to EU customers, there should be no issue. A lot of companies, in Great Britain, ones that are doing this, there are others that are doing this. So great for the Netherlands, I guess, jobs creating over there, revenue and stuff like that over there, shouts out to the Dutch. The aim was to fulfill direct to EU consumer business from its website and Amazon smaller business sales to bike shops, but it's still costing £10,000 in overhead. You can imagine the warehouse in the Netherlands is not cheap, especially with the increased demand. Plus, you need to be registered in the EU. You need I think it's an EORI number, so you can pay like VAT and things like that. You need staff as well. Then you still need to pay customs when you move the mass of goods from GB to the Netherlands. As 2022 progressed, it became apparent that EU sales were not going to recover to their pre-Brexit levels, and the warehouse would be operating at a loss. So for the warehouse to be operating at a loss is surprising. Could be due to a whole host of factors, but without Brexit there would be no need for a warehouse. I'm assuming it's down to the cost of the warehouse and obviously the lack of sales within the EU. He says, quote, "To say the Brexit process was gritty is an understatement. Within 12 months of having got it up and running, we had to take this decision to close it because it wasn't covering its costs," said Lowe. Cycloc products are still being sold direct to customers in the EU via an import one-stop shop in Ireland, an automated service to cover complex VAT compliance procedures. So now they're having to pay a third party to deal with the EU checks and the paperwork, which cannot be cheap. Plus the fact that if the goods are going to, say, France, the goods would go potentially from GB to Ireland, and then back towards France, which just adds a ton of extra shipping. It's just more costs on top of more costs. Cycloc's experience mirrors that of Cheshire Cheese Company. We talk about Cheshire Cheese Man once in a while, which made headlines all over the world in 2021 when it declared Brexit had cost it £250,000, and his cost would be a lot higher because of the vet checks and certificates that are needed. Leading a government minister to suggest it look to global markets to plug the Brexit hole, and we went over why that's a dumb idea at the time. Last November, its owner Simon Spurrell said those losses had ballooned to £600,000, and he had sold the firm to a larger rival to improve access to the single market. And I don't know how selling his company helps him get more access to the single market, maybe poor phrasing here, but here you can see a medium-sized business with costs that are well over £100,000 due to being a third country. You're talking £600,000 here for Cheshire Cheese Company. And the cycling company, it does sell to the US as well, but that's an ocean away with completely different rules and a completely different market. The business is now trying to pivot quickly, the Cycloc one, to new markets in the US, Asia, Australia and South Africa, said Patron McCleary, head of marketing. But the learning to get into those markets is also a drain on resources. In places like China or Hong Kong, I'm having to learn a lot about the culture, about buying habits and how British products are viewed. It would have been easier in Europe, but because of how bad Brexit actually was, we've actually had to be quite reactive rather than proactive, he said, end quote. And the other problem is, if you imagine how this thing is mounted, it's mounted onto a wall, so you have to make sure that the walls are adequate. I don't know what construction rules are like in China, but you don't want to stick this thing onto potentially a plasterboard wall because it might not hold. You also have to take into account how popular cycling is in these countries, but more importantly, China and Hong Kong don't have the wealth that a lot of EU countries have, so demand will be inherently lower. Also, the cost of shipping across the world from GB to China would be comically expensive. Business to customer sales would be really difficult. You'd have to still deal with customs fees on top of that. There are really limited options for these businesses. The Tories can keep telling businesses to look at emerging markets, but the truth is it's expensive to do that, and in some cases it's simply not worth it. For example, they could look at a country like Bangladesh where cycling is very popular because it's a very flat land. But, would people have, £43 to spend or, £100 to spend on one of these wall mounts? Not unless you're very wealthy, like upper middle class maybe in Bangladesh. And it will be the same with a lot of developing nations. So many companies that could expand in the UK, but instead are looking the other way. What a Brexit win. Some of these companies could really expand their staffing and manufacturing in the UK and start becoming, global players here. But the problem is they can't do that because Brexit's hampered them so much. They've lost one of their key markets in Europe. You're talking 50% of this man's sales were in the EU, and he's lost 25% of that. So half his sales were coming from abroad. The EU specifically, not the US, not developing markets, not even the half from the UK. I think maybe not even that, to be fair. So I'm rambling a bit here. But if he's saying half is coming from the EU, that means some of his sales would be coming from the US, and a lot of it would be coming from the UK. So you can imagine how big that market is for him. and he's lost it. He's lost half of that half. It's just wild. So I kind of lost my brain here, my train of thought. But anyways, I'm gonna leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.